Hello to you. I want to speak with you today about the three temples of God. Actually, we could say four. Actually, what we want to speak about is the three different kinds of temples and the fulfillment of the temple in the New Testament temple, which is quite different from the type and the shadow of the Old Covenant. The first temple was not a temple at all, but a portable tent. It was called the Tabernacle, or tent of meeting. God gave Moses explicit instructions about constructing this tabernacle and told him several times to make absolutely sure that he stuck to the pattern. And this included the pattern, the colors, the materials, the precious metals. Everything in the tabernacle was meaningful and could not be deviated from in any way. After wandering in the desert for many years with the tabernacle, the Israelites at last entered into the promised land. And after a time, King David wanted to construct a house for God to live in. But God would not let him construct this house. He told him that his hands were too bloody with war and too tainted with sin. And he said that the son of David would construct the temple. David and his son Solomon took this to mean that Solomon would construct the temple, and Solomon proceeded to do so. And when he dedicated the temple, he said that a building of stone could not contain the God of the heavens. He understood this. Nevertheless, he built the temple, and God allowed it. God meant when he said that his son, David's son, would construct the temple, he meant that Jesus, who would come from the house of David, who was the Son of God and the Son of Man, who was God manifested in the flesh, would construct the temple of God. But he allowed the earthly temple to be built because it filled the type and the shadow that was to be set up concerning the true temple. The temple stood for years, and then it was destroyed when the Israelites were invaded by Babylon and were taken away into Babylon. The temple was destroyed, and the Babylonians took away most of the precious metals and containers that the temple was made of, that were in the temple. God's holy furniture, God's holy vessels were carried away into Babylon and lost. Years later, when the Israelites were allowed to return, they set about to rebuild the temple. I'm shortening this quite a bit because much of the Old Testament is taken up with telling this story, but I want to make it short and simple. While the Israelites set about to rebuild the temple, the prophet relates in his book that the true temple would be built by the branch and it would be built not by human might and power, but by God's Spirit. Here is another prophecy of what the true temple would actually be. Now, the Israelites had no way of understanding this at the time, so they continued to put up the temple. All they could understand was physical temple, a building where God's glory would reside, where would be the Ark of the Covenant, and all the materials, all the parts of worship, the animal sacrifices, the blood, the Day of Atonement could be carried out. All the rituals that had been set up of worship, and where the priests and the high priests could perform their duties on behalf of the people. But at the same time, God was saying that it was not by might and not by power that the temple would be erected, but by His Spirit. In the New Testament, Jesus comes to the temple in Jerusalem, and He chases out the money changers. He makes a whip out of cord. He turns over the tables. He says, "My Father's house is to be a house of prayer." And he's confronted by the religious leaders, and they ask him by what authority he does these things. And he says, "Tear down this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And we're told right there in John that he was not speaking of the temple that was standing there, because they said, "This building was 46 years to complete, and you're going to tear it down and rebuild it in 3 days?" But he was not speaking of that temple. He was speaking of the temple of his body. So when Jesus walked the earth, the true glory of God was not in that temple any longer. The true glory of God was in Jesus, but they did not recognize him. In John, in the first chapter, it tells us that he came unto his own, but his own knew him not. He was the temple of God. He was the manifestation of God's glory. Hebrews tells us that he was the very image of the living God, of the Father on earth. But they did not recognize him. So he was speaking of the temple of his body. Now he told the woman at the well that temple worship, that is, worship in a building made of stone, was ceasing. And that the time had come for people to worship God in spirit and in truth. He said God is a spirit, and he seeks those who worship him in spirit and in truth. So once again, he's taking the emphasis off the temple as a building made of stone, and he's putting it on something else, something higher, something spiritual. Later on, Jesus goes to the cross and dies and is raised again.